I just want to say thanks for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. I am honored and humbled to have a conversation about mass incarceration in this space. And I want to acknowledge my co-author, longtime collaborator in the back of the room, Brian Sykes, here. And the key point I want to make, which may be very familiar to some of you, is that the sheer scale of criminal justice contact among Black and Latino men make it a central concern for accounts of inequality in the United States. That's it. That's one really important takeaway. You might have heard a lot of talk lately about mass incarceration, and I want to frame this central observation in the context of some things that we've been talking a lot about lately. And the first is, this figure just illustrates crime until perhaps the last year, maybe two. Crime has been on the decline for the last 20 years. So this, I'm not sure why this is auto-forwarding, but crime has been on the decline for the last 20 years. Measures of crime, both violent and property crime, reached their peak in the mid-1990s, which coincidentally was when I started working on this field. But we've seen declines in crime by pretty much any measure since the mid-1990s, such that by the mid-2010s, so into 2014, crime rates rivaled those in the late 60s and early 70s. And I think the key observation to make here is that mass incarceration is not about crime. Mass incarceration is about shifts in policy that have led to differential surveillance, differential prosecution, and differential sentencing that have disproportionately affected certain subgroups of the population, most notably young African-American men with very low levels of formal schooling. I also want to acknowledge that there are some areas in the country and some neighborhoods where crime and violence are unconscionably high. Exposure to trauma is a routine aspect of life. But nationwide, and in most jurisdictions, crime has been on the decline for over 20 years. I also want to frame this in the context, there's been a lot of talk about criminal justice reform. In my home state of Texas, where I live now, this started even in the early 2000s. The Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act was a bipartisan initiative, didn't pass in the end, but a bipartisan initiative that led to, or that emphasized the value of potentially important things like community policing and sentencing reform. And so there have been reforms, there's been lots of talk of reform at the federal government level, and there have been reforms at state and local levels that have emphasized community policing, limited or ceased prison and jail construction, and led to sentencing reforms. I want to just note a few headlines about my home state of Texas. And these, so in 2014, in February of 2017, and most recently in May of 2017, Texas has been identified as leading the way in criminal justice reforms. And I just want to say, I'm relatively new to Texas. I've been there 3 years. There's a lot I like about it. But I'm also spending a lot of time observing in prisons and jails and courts, and I'm having a hard time reconciling it as the model of reform with what I'm seeing. It still has the second largest prison population, and there is massive racial and ethnic inequality in contact with the criminal justice system. Incarceration is just one dimension of that. And 5 million people in the state of Texas every year get some sort of criminal sanction. So in the state of Texas, even a speeding ticket is a criminal offense. And as you can imagine, the system is vast and extensive. But all of this, incarceration has declined in the last, since the peak of incarceration in the United States was in 2008, 2009. And at that point, 2.3 million Americans were in prison or jail. That's 1 in 100 American adults were in prison or jail at the end of 2008. Now it's 2.2 million. 2.2 million. So we went from 1 in 100 to 1 in 115. And the Sentencing Project estimates it will take 75 years of decline at this rate to reach pre-epidemic levels. So I want to put this in comparative historical perspective. And just say, I have left out, or we have left out from these slides, the peak incarceration time in the United States, end of 2008, beginning of 2009. So the US incarcerates a much larger fraction than any other advanced industrialized country. Sorry about this. And we did so in 1983, in the early years, even more so in 2001, even more so in 2008 and 2009. But even now, with the declines, the incarceration rate in the United States is dramatically higher than in these other countries. But for the purposes of today, incarceration is disproportionately concentrated among young men, African Americans and Latinos, and especially those with low levels of formal schooling, such that in 2015, 9.1% of non-Hispanic Black men between the ages of 20 and 34 were incarcerated on any given day. That's 1 in 11. And I just want to ask a question. If 9% of young white men were incarcerated on any given day, what would the policy conversation look like? And incarceration is also intergenerational. So there was another slide which showed, and you can read it in the paper, that there are approximately 2.5 million children that have a parent incarcerated on any given day, and that is also concentrated. Exposure to parental incarceration is concentrated among African American children. And so that 1 in 10 African American children on any given day has a parent incarcerated in federal, state, or local prison or jail. Now, I want to just say a couple of things in closing. One is that incarceration, in my mind, is just the tip of the iceberg. There are 2.2 million people incarcerated in prison or jail. There are another 4.7 million under formal surveillance of the criminal justice system, and over 20 million people are arrested in a given year. So this system is vast, and it is disproportionately concentrated among those with low levels of education and among people of color. So I want to just end with, despite decades of declines in crime and much talk of criminal justice reform, incarceration and criminal justice contact more broadly are a central axis of racial and ethnic inequality in the United States.